The Pacific sun hammered down on the USS Pacific Falcon, its steel deck shimmering like a mirror to the sky. The roar of jet engines faded into the background as every eye turned toward Admiral Fletcher, his shadow cutting across the painted launch lines. In his fist was not a clipboard, not a headset, but a mop, its wet strands dripping onto the deck. Lieutenant Hoa Karen, his voice cracked like a whip, "Your command privileges are revoked. Effective immediately." The words landed heavier than the heat. A ripple of laughter rolled through the ranks of officers, gathered in tight formation. Some didn't even try to hide their grins. Karen's gaze didn't flinch. She stepped forward, took the mop without a word, the handle rough in her calloused palms. Her boots thudded softly against the deck as she walked away, each step echoing longer than the Admiral's order. The mop swung at her side like a flag of surrender she refused to raise. Behind her, the younger officer's snickers cut sharp and deliberate into the air. She kept her jaw locked, her eyes ahead, letting the sting of humiliation sink into the steel of her spine. The reflective vest clung to her shoulders, damp with sweat. She could feel the Pacific wind against the back of her neck, teasing the tightly bound strands of her black hair. Somewhere deep beneath the sting, an older voice steadied her, the voice of her father, the man who had clawed his way from a single rust-streaked freighter to a modest shipping empire. She saw him again on the docks of Cam Ranh Bay, his weathered hands gripping her shoulders, the smell of salt and diesel in the air. "You don't bend, Karen. Not for anyone." She'd been 16 then, her hands soft, her dreams big. Now, those hands were rough from years of guiding jets through storms and crosswinds. And even holding a mop on a deck where she once commanded launches, she stood tall. Hours later, the sting of public demotion still hung in the air when the unthinkable happened. The signal coordination system heart of every launch failed mid-operation. Sirens wailed, screens blinked with scrambled codes, voices snapped orders that fell apart mid-sentence. Officers scrambled, flipping through thick manuals, hands flying across panels in panic. From her place on the periphery, still gripping the mop, Karen's eyes locked on a faint 8-digit code flashing in the corner of a secondary display. Faint, but unmistakable. She moved before thinking, stepping into the chaos. "Secondary launch grids interrupted," she called out, her voice cutting clean through the noise. The lead technician, a man with a coffee stain across his sleeve, froze mid-command. "What?" She pointed at the code. "Check the grid, now." He hesitated, then obeyed. The system jolted back to life, alarms falling silent. The deck crew moved in perfect sync as if nothing had happened. An F-18 screamed forward, lifted into the sky, and vanished into the blue. The sudden quiet afterward was heavier than the noise before. Admiral Fletcher stood still, his eyes fixed on her, not blinking. Karen turned away before the silence could morph into anything else. She set the mop against a crate, its wooden shaft clattering softly against the steel. Moving to the deck's edge, she let her gaze sweep across the Pacific, endless, unyielding. The sunlight hit the waves, scattering diamonds across their peaks. For a brief moment, she let the wind cool the sweat on her skin. This wasn't her first fight, and she knew it wouldn't be her last. The murmurs from behind her were quieter now, tinged not with mockery but with something sharper: curiosity. That night, the atmosphere in the operations room felt like a pressure cooker. The air was thick with burnt coffee, paper rustle, and nervous energy. Karen stood at the back, clipboard tucked under her arm, noting every word of the Admiral's NATO exercise briefing. Officers in pressed uniforms moved like they belonged here. She moved like she had been exiled. Commander Holt, wiry with a smirk that never faded, glanced over his shoulder. "Lieutenant Karen, right? You're the one they pulled off the deck." He made sure his voice carried. "Guess you're better at mopping than signaling now." A couple of officers chuckled, eyes darting toward her. In the corner, a young ensign leaned toward his buddy. "She's the one who botched that launch last year." They didn't know or didn't care that a faulty sensor had been the real cause. Her pen paused just long enough for the ink to blot the page. She didn't look up, didn't defend herself. The numbers on her paper stayed steady under her hand. The room moved on, but the words lingered, hanging like smoke in stale air. Outside, somewhere beyond the steel walls, the ocean kept rolling. Under the gray wash of dawn, The Pacific Falcon's deck felt colder than usual, the air thick with salt and jet fuel. Crew members moved in brisk lines, prepping for the day's inspections. Karen, still officially reassigned, stood near a stack of sealed crates at her assigned station. She was jotting supply codes when a sudden stumble caught her attention. Ensign Carter, all sharp elbows and jittery energy, tripped over a snaking power cable. He caught himself on a crate and spun toward her with a scowl. "Watch where you're standing, Karen. You're not even supposed to be here." His tone carried for the benefit of the deckhands nearby. Two of them smirked openly, one mimicking her posture with an exaggerated slump. Karen didn't rise to the bait. She shifted her clipboard under one arm, leaned down just enough to let her fingers brush the offending cable. "You're right," she said evenly. "I shouldn't be here. But that cable you tripped over? It's mislaid, check it." Carter hesitated, his mouth still open for another insult. Then something in her tone, calm but unyielding, made him bend and follow the cable's path. The tangle was clear as day, enough to have delayed the next launch or worse. Without a word, he set about fixing it. The deckhand's laughter faded to an awkward shuffle, their eyes sliding away from her. Karen returned to her log sheet without another glance. By mid-morning, a different tension rippled through the deck. The crew was prepping an F-35 for a scheduled launch when the radar system began spitting error codes. Red lights flared across the control panel, alarms chattering in sharp bursts. Voices spiked text shouting serial numbers, flipping through thick manuals, hands flying over consoles. Karen stood just outside the perimeter, her status keeping her off the official roster for this launch. But her eyes caught something faint, digits blinking on an auxiliary screen, half hidden by the clutter of alerts. 8 numbers etched into her memory from a similar failure years ago. She stepped forward, voice clear and cutting through the rising chaos. Temporary interruption from the secondary launch grid. The lead tech, a square-shouldered man with a buzz cut and a coffee stain on his sleeve, swung around. "What?" Karen pointed at the screen. "Check the grid feed. Now." He hesitated, but urgency won. Fingers flew, toggling the sequence she'd called. In seconds, the error codes collapsed. The roar of the F-35's engines swelled, and the aircraft thundered down the deck. When it lifted clean into the sky, the only sound left was the ocean wind. From his post, Captain Wynn's gaze locked on her. His brow creased not in suspicion, but in reevaluation, as if seeing a piece of a puzzle click into place. She gave a small shrug, sliding her hands back into her vest pockets, and stepped out of the spotlight before anyone could speak. Later, in the dim hum of the ops room, Petty Officer Ruiz ambled over. Stocky, loud, gum snapping between his teeth, he leaned in just enough for the scent of spearmint to cut through the stale air. "So, Karen," he said, voice pitched to Carrie, "they say you used to run this deck. What happened? Couldn't hack it?" A few nearby techs looked up, their smirks sharpening. Karen kept her eyes on the checklist in her hands. "I'm still here," she replied, tone almost soft. Then she looked up just enough to meet his eyes. "And you're still chewing gum during briefings." The jab landed clean. Ruiz froze, the rhythmic snap of gum dying mid-chew. He muttered something about equipment checks and backed off. The smirks around the room dissolved into the quiet scratch of pens on paper. That night, she sat alone in the mess hall's far corner, plain sandwich, black coffee, nothing else. The room was alive with chatter and the clatter of trays. Major Duncan, voice booming like a parade commander, strode past her table and tossed a military journal onto her tray. The pages flapped open to an old feature. "Top 5 flight deck coordinators in the fleet. Used to be top 5, huh? Now you mop floors." His buddies laughed, one nearly choking on his drink. Lieutenant Baxter leaned in, her polished nails catching the light, her voice sweet enough to rot fruit. People still call her Broken Wing Karen. Karen's fingers tightened around her coffee mug, the heat biting her skin. She rose, collected her tray, and walked out without a backward glance. The laughter trailed her down the corridor like smoke from a dying fire, lingering, but already thinning. The next morning, a call came down from Fletcher's office. Reassignment. She was off tech entirely, sent to the supply hold. The air there was thick with oil and metal, the lighting a permanent shade of dusk. As she checked crates of dummy ammunition, a cargo loader with an anchor tattoo on his forearm sauntered past. "Legendary warrior now counting bolts," he said to his buddy with a grin. Karen noted the serial number in her hand, closed the log sheet, and looked at him. Legendary warriors don't lose count. Then she went back to work. From above, she could still feel the ship's pulse muted, but constant. Somewhere out there, the flight deck roared on without her. But the ocean didn't care who carried the mop. Neither did she. By the third day in the supply hold, Karen had memorized the rhythm of the ship's heartbeat, the low vibration of engines, the muted thud of boots on metal far above her, the occasional groan of shifting steel. She was logging a crate of replacement landing lights when a petty officer appeared in the doorway, his silhouette sharp against the brighter corridor. "Lieutenant Karen," he said, voice clipped. "You're wanted on deck. Now." She didn't ask why. The narrow stairwells groaned under her boots as she climbed toward the sunlight. When she stepped onto the flight deck, the air hit her like a wall, hot, loud, restless. A manual signal drill was underway, and it was unraveling fast. Without electronic guidance, the crew's hand signals were sloppy, out of sync. An F-18 sat half-ready, its engines idling with a vibration that made the deck shiver. Captain Wynn's jaw was tight, his hands on his hips as he barked corrections that fell apart before they reached the crew. Admiral Fletcher stood near the tower, arms crossed, face unreadable. A nervous ensign fidgeting with his gloves murmured to someone beside him. Karen used to be one of the top-rated signal officers. That single sentence seemed to travel faster than the wind. Fletcher's gaze cut to her. His nod was almost imperceptible. "Get her!" A petty officer shoved a signal vest into her hands. The fabric was warm from the sun. She slipped it on, stepping forward into the circle of heat and noise. Without a word, she raised her arms, the movement sharp, precise, impossible to mistake. The deck crew adjusted instinctively, their positions realigning as though muscle memory had snapped them into place. The pilot's helmet turned toward her. She gave the launch sequence by hand, every gesture flowing into the next, the kind of clean precision only years of practice could make look effortless. The F-18 rolled forward, picking up speed until the nose lifted into the sky. The roar of the engines faded into the horizon, leaving behind a silence that was almost reverent. Wynn exhaled. Fletcher's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something closer to calculation. Karen didn't wait for praise. She stripped off the vest, handed it to the nearest crewman, and turned toward the edge of the deck. The Pacific stretched wide and indifferent, the sun flashing off its surface like it was keeping secrets. During the break, a group of pilots clustered near the flight line. Their helmets dangled from their fingers, their voices low but edged with bravado. Lieutenant Pierce, the one with a thin scar above his eyebrow, spotted her adjusting a signal flag. "Karen," he called, loud enough to cut through the chatter, "you're wasting your time out here. Supply holds where you belong." The others laughed, one slapping him on the back. Karen didn't look up. Her hands paused on the flag's edge, fingers smoothing the fabric. "You flew my signal yesterday, Pierce," she said, voice steady. "You landed clean because of it." The laughter died fast. Pierce's smirk thinned, and the other pilots found sudden interest in their boots. Karen tied off the flag and walked away, the wind carrying her words farther than she had intended. A week later, the NATO exercise hit its peak. An emergency scenario had the deck crew scrambling a high-stakes F-18 launch without electronics. Timed to the second, Fletcher's boots clanged against the metal as he approached her. The deck was a storm of noise and motion, but his voice was low, almost a hiss. One wrong hand gesture, and the whole squadron explodes. "You sure you're ready?" Karen's eyes didn't waver. "I don't go off," she said, each word deliberate. Then she leaned just enough for only him to hear. "Are you steady?" For the briefest moment, his eyes flickered. Then he stepped back, hat casting his face in shadow. She turned to the jet, vest catching the sun. Her left arm rose, right arm swept through a perfect arc, level 1 certified. The kind of move that made even seasoned crew members straighten unconsciously. The F-18 roared down the deck, lifting into the air with no hesitation, trailing smoke that curled into the wind like a signature. The crew erupted, applause mixing with shouts, the sound rolling across the deck. Fletcher removed his cap, dipped his head in the smallest of nods. Karen didn't smile. She simply stepped back from the launch line, the echo of the jet still in her chest. Respect, once shattered, was finding its way back, but not all at once. The NATO exercise was barely over when the Pacific Falcon's deck turned into a hive of flashing cameras and clipped foreign accents. Helicopters ferried journalists from half a dozen countries, their windblown hair and heavy press passes flapping in the Pacific breeze. The crew tightened ranks, officers standing in formal lines as Admiral Fletcher led the visitors past gleaming jets and polished railings. Karen stood in the background, reflective vest creased from work, clipboard in hand, her face unreadable. A British reporter with sharp eyes and a leather-bound notebook spotted her first. She broke from the group with the precision of someone who'd been waiting. "Lieutenant Karen, isn't it?" The tone wasn't curious, it was a scalpel. "You were Plan B today, weren't you? If the system hadn't failed, you'd still be mopping floors." The air between them seemed to tighten. Several microphones swung in her direction. Karen didn't blink. She reached into the pocket of her vest and pulled out a folded, weathered sheet, a scanned CIA document, creased from weeks of being carried. The header read, "Operation Tidal Edge." "I coordinated this," she said, voice even, carrying easily over the whir of the deck's ventilation systems. "My record was sealed for 3 years by order." The British reporter's pen stopped mid-scratch. Around them, the background chatter dulled. Even a cameraman lowered his lens, mouth slightly open. Karen folded the paper back into its creases and returned it to her pocket, the movement deliberate, unhurried. She turned to walk away, but another voice cut in, smooth and accented. A French journalist with slick-back hair and designer glasses stepped into her path. "Lieutenant, your story is inspiring," he said, his smile a touch too wide. "But surely you must feel bitter. Reduced to cleaning while others take credit, no?" It was a trap, laid with sugar. The cluster of reporters leaned closer, their microphones hovering like wasps. Karen's fingers brushed the edge of her vest, her gaze locked on his without wavering. "I do my job," she said, calm and firm. "Credit's not my concern, results are." The Frenchman's smile faltered, his next question dying before it reached his lips. Karen stepped past him, her boots scuffing the deck, leaving only the faint scent of jet fuel and salt in her wake. By the next morning, word of the exchange had spread beyond the crew. Some of the same officers who'd mocked her now watched her with something closer to caution. In the mess hall, whispers rose and fell as she passed, though they didn't carry the same bite they once had. It was that morning the ceremony was announced. The sun was high, the deck gleaming as the crew assembled. Karen stood in her dress uniform, hair tied back so tight not a strand moved in the wind. Admiral Fletcher stepped forward, a small medal in hand. Special signal coordination, the metal glinting like captured sunlight. He pinned it to her chest with steady fingers, though his eyes didn't quite meet hers. "Lieutenant Commander Hoa Karen," he said, voice amplified by the wind and the unblinking stares of every officer on deck. The title landed like a shockwave. The same ensigns who'd laughed behind her back now snapped into salute, their eyes locked forward. Overhead, an F-22 streaked across the sky, tracing the exact launch path she had signaled days before. The roar rolled over the ship, drowning out the murmurs that followed. She didn't bask in it. She simply stood there, shoulders square, metal heavy on her uniform. But she saw the small shift in the eyes around her mockery replaced by something they weren't ready to call respect. That evening in the hangar bay, she was cornered by Commander Tate, a man whose scowl was as permanent as the grease under his fingernails. "You got lucky," he muttered to a cluster of techs, his voice pitched just loud enough for her to hear. Anyone could have waved their arms like that. Karen was wiping grease from her hands, back to him, but her shoulders stiffened. She turned just enough to catch his gaze. "Luck doesn't launch a jet, Tate. Precision does." The rag dropped onto a crate with a soft, deliberate thud. She walked away without waiting for his reply, the techs exchanging glances in her wake. Out on the deck, the last light of day spilled across the Pacific. She paused at the railing, the wind lifting strands of her hair, and slipped a hand into her pocket to feel the folded photograph of her father. She didn't pull it out, she didn't need to. The ship hummed under her feet, steady as the pulse in her wrist, and she knew the fight wasn't over. It never was. Consequences on a warship rarely arrived with ceremony. They crept in quietly, changing the rhythm of the place until you realized things would never go back. Within a week of the medal ceremony, the Pacific Falcon's corridors had new silences in them. Spaces once filled with snide laughter now muted. Major Duncan was the first to vanish from the daily pattern. Word filtered down in fragments, reassigned to a desk job at a stateside logistics office. No fanfare, no goodbyes, just gone. His booming voice no longer echoed through the mess hall. Someone said his career had stalled for good. No one spoke his name above a whisper. The young ensign who'd whispered about her botched launch found himself standing in front of the executive officer for a formal reprimand. His promotion date was pushed back a year. The change in him was visible. His once easy grin had vanished, replaced by the fixed stare of someone counting every step until he could disappear from notice. Lieutenant Baxter, with her polished nails and honeyed venom, fared differently. A deckhand, tired of her comments, had quietly passed along a recording of her broken wing Karen, remarked to a friend on shore. By morning, screenshots were spreading through military forums. By nightfall, her sponsorship with a popular gear brand had evaporated, her name and face scrubbed from their website. She moved through the ship's narrow halls with her eyes down, shoulders tight, as if trying to slip through walls. Even the cargo loader from the supply hold, the one with the anchor tattoo, was transferred without ceremony to a small maintenance vessel that rarely left port. His boisterous laugh was replaced by a new dockhand's awkward quiet. Karen didn't lift a finger in any of it. She didn't need to. The truth had weight, and it settled fast when given space. She kept to her routines, logging inventory with her meticulous hand, running occasional drills with the flight crew when ordered, and spending long minutes at the deck's edge, watching the horizon turn from blue to black. But now, when she stepped into a room, conversation faltered not from disdain, but from a carefulness that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, she was called to the ops room to review a draft of a new signal protocol. She flipped through the thick manual at the far end of the table, pen tracing notes in the margins. Lieutenant Carver, boots polished enough to catch the ceiling lights, leaned over her shoulder. His grin was the overconfident kind that didn't need an audience. "Don't strain yourself, Karen," he said, voice pitched so the room could hear. "That stuff's for real signal officers." Pens stilled mid-scratch. A couple of glances flicked her way, waiting. Karen closed the manual, fingers resting on the cover, and turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. "Last week," she said evenly, "I signaled your jet out of a jam. You're welcome." Silence landed like a dropped wrench. Carver's grin faltered. He stepped back, the scrape of his boots loud in the stillness. Karen reopened the manual and continued reading as if nothing had been said, but the air in the room had shifted heavier now, charged. The days slipped toward docking, and Karen's presence on deck became less of an anomaly. During a final inspection of the supply hold, she heard Boots stop behind her. Ellis, a quiet deckhand who rarely spoke above the hum of engines, was holding a worn logbook. "Monroe," he paused, corrected himself. "Karen signed off on every crate in the hold. Not one mistake. Not one." He closed the book with a soft thump, tucking it under his arm. Around him, other deckhands nodded without meeting her eyes, as if acknowledging her too openly might break the moment. She didn't look up from the inventory sheet in her hand, but the corner of her mouth shifted just enough for Ellis to notice. That night, she walked the deck one last time before the Pacific Falcon reached port. The Pacific stretched out in front of her, lit in ribbons of gold by the setting sun. The smell of salt and fuel clung to the air. A young recruit, the same one who'd once whispered about her, approached, cap twisting nervously in his hands. "Ma'am," he said, voice low, "I didn't know about everything." Karen looked at him, steady but not unkind, the way her father once had when she'd failed her first navigation exam. "You don't always need to know," she said softly. "Just do your job right." He nodded, the lines in his face easing. She turned back to the water, fingers brushing the worn edge of the photograph in her pocket. She didn't take it out. She never needed to. The ship's engines rumbled beneath her feet, steady as her own heartbeat. She knew the next fight would come because on a ship like this, it always did. But she'd be ready. Dusk fell over the Pacific Falcon as she cut through the last stretch toward port, the horizon smoldering in shades of orange and deep red. The air was thick with salt and the faint tang of fuel, a smell that had lived in the steel bones of the ship for decades. Karen stood near the forward railing, the wind tugging at the hem of her uniform jacket, watching the distant silhouette of the harbor grow sharper against the fading sky. Around her, the crew moved in purposeful lines, but the usual chatter was absent. Something about this return felt different. By the time the ship slowed and the long pier stretched out to meet them, the officers were assembled in their dress uniforms. Fletcher gave clipped orders from the tower, his voice carrying over the quiet thrum of the engines. Karen adjusted the strap of her duffel bag across her shoulder. The metal Fletcher had pinned on her days ago glinted faintly in the last light, each reflection a small, unspoken reminder of the path she had walked to stand here again. When the gangway lowered with a metallic groan, she stepped forward. The crowd of officers parted without a word, their salutes snapping into place in perfect unison. The movement was sharp, precise, not the stiff courtesy of obligation, but the deliberate mark of respect. Eyes followed her as she crossed the narrow span to the pier, boots striking a steady rhythm that matched the hum still running through the ship's hull. She didn't look back, not at the lines of faces or the tower or the deck she'd fought to reclaim. Ahead, at the end of the pier, a tall figure waited, hands in his pockets, back straight against the wash of the sunset. Daniel. He didn't speak when she reached him. Instead, his hand brushed hers lightly, fingers catching for just a moment before falling into step beside her. That touch was enough. Words would have been too small for the weight of what had passed. Behind them, the officers remained standing, a still formation silhouetted against the deepening glow of the sky. The air felt heavier now, not oppressive, but solid, as though the ship itself was holding its breath. Karen could feel their eyes on her back until she stepped off the pier entirely. They walked to the car parked just beyond the last bollard, the sound of gulls breaking the stillness. Daniel opened the door for her, but before she slid in, Karen turned slightly toward the harbor. From this angle, the Pacific Falcon loomed dark against the horizon, a jagged shadow etched in gold. She thought of the mops and crates, of the jeers in the mess hall, of the sting of her father's words that had never been meant to hurt but to hold her upright. Life didn't always hand you a stage to prove who you were. Sometimes it handed you a broom, a clipboard, a room full of people who thought they knew the ending to your story before you'd written it. The measure of a person wasn't in the moment the spotlight found them, but in the steps they kept taking when no one was looking. As they pulled away, the ship slipped from view, hidden behind the industrial sprawl of the docks. Karen leaned back in her seat, the hum of the tires on the road blending into the memory of the ship's engines. She could still feel the deck beneath her feet, the Pacific wind on her face, the precise weight of the signal flags in her hands. For everyone who had been pushed aside, underestimated, or quietly written off, she knew this truth now as bone-deep fact. You weren't wrong to keep going. You weren't wrong to stand your ground in silence until the moment came to prove it. The city lights began to flicker on ahead, casting their glow into the rising night. Karen reached into her pocket and brushed her fingers over the photograph of her father, creased and worn, edges frayed from years of carrying it close. She didn't take it out. She didn't have to. His voice was still with her, steady and rough. Don't bend. She smiled faintly, just enough for Daniel to notice, though he said nothing. Outside, the world was waiting another horizon, another fight, and she was already moving toward it.